think like now today with the Jamstack in 2024, it truly is like living in the future between generative AI and new toolings, and just from how far we've come since the term was coined. And I'm gonna go talk about that time that's passed, and what happened since then, and where I think we could be going next. A little bit about me. I'm CEO and co-founder of Netlify. Netlify today serves more than a billion unique visitors to the site, stores, and app running on our Edge network every single month. We've onboarded more than 4.5 million developers to our platform, raised 212 million in capital from amazing partners, and are here to build a great platform for us all to build on. We work with customers across anything from people building their very first portfolio right out of code school, to the core engineering team at Twilio, to large enterprises like Unilever or Fortune brands, and have really built a platform that's agnostic to what you're building, what kind of company you are, but really focused on building for the web and for the front end. And building this was only possible because of this change from the way we did things before into the way we did things after the emergence of the Jamstack. So I'm gonna go back in time to almost 8 years ago, at this moment, back in the year of 2016. Very different times, but in some ways it's still the same. We were all running around playing Pokemon Go. UK decided to go their own strange path, and at the time that I'm talking about, we still thought that guy in the lower corner was just a joke. And Netlify at the time was this tiny seed stage startup, about a handful of people, 6 people or so, building our platform for modern websites. And back then, in April 2016, I got asked to give a talk at the stage of the Smashing Magazine's conference here in San Francisco, called the New Frontend Stack. And that was the talk where I first introduced the term Jamstack to the world. This was the first slide that mentioned it to the public. Now, in that talk, I sort of started with a little bit of history of the web and where we came from, with this very first ever website, and the way it was a really simple setup, right? Like a file on the server, other people could find it and click through hyperlinks to go from destination to destination. We then introduced the idea of a program, at first in a folder called CGI bin, that the server would call out to when a request came in. We could then build back a page on demand and get sort of the first dynamic websites. To actually do stuff with that, people started introducing the idea of a database, that was really like you had like your server and your database, and every time a request came in, you would get a bunch of different queries in the database and show something. And then as the web started growing, we needed to start scaling this in different ways, right? Like, so we had to start introducing a cache between the server and the program, and between the program and the database. Again, all of these are my original slides from 8 years ago, right? The next step, as this started being the way to build, was introducing like CDNs in the middle. As the web started going global and you had to reach people not just next to you or next to your server, but all over the world. And now we started having like this pretty complex system we all had to live with back then, across monitoring and cache invalidation and release engineering and versioning and migrations and tunings and so on. And it had brought us to the point back in 2016 where the web in general was really struggling with security, reliability, and performance. this was like an announcement that the Drupal team back then Drupal was really like just one of the de facto ways to build for the web, right? And they sent out an announcement saying like, we just got a vulnerability. If you haven't patched it within 7 hours after the announcement, you should just consider your whole infrastructure to be compromised, and maybe start over, right? Like, we all got really used to visiting pages from Hacker News or Slashdot or whatever the social platform was back then, and get these kind of database missing screens. And we were at a time where, when we were raising our seed round back then, we often got the question like, well, why are you building something for the web? Isn't it all going to be mobile applications or social media or instant articles? Like, is anyone really building for this platform anymore? Like, the challenges we faced back then had been an actual like threat to the web and an excuse for walled gardens. It was a very different world back then. Brian was talking about it just in the last 4 years, but if you think back 8 years ago now, when I gave this first talk on the Jamstack, it was really a different place, right? This was Gartner's Magic Quadrant for Web Content Management by the end of 2016, talking about like Sitecore, Adobe Experience Manager, Acquia, the company behind Drupal, Episerver, Automatic was there, right? Like all these big monolithic CMS systems that people would build with. And at the sort of more like day-to-day front-end developer world, these were probably the tools that you would go to if you were building a new project. WordPress is the absolutely dominating force on new websites, Ruby and Rails for full stack applications, Drupal, Expression Engine, Joomla, and Magento as sort of like the most popular e-commerce platform. All monolithic, end-to-end, end-tiered applications depending on a server and a database and so on. And we had this spiring new ecosystem around the modern web and a different way to do things. But it's just important to remember how small it was back then, and how early, right? Like we had like static site generators like Jekyll and Hugo was still in its early days. The build tools of the time were mainly Grunt and Gulp, with Webpack having sort of just emerged into the space. Contentful, when I gave this talk, had not even raised a Series A. They were a Series C startup in Germany, talking mostly about mobile being the reason you would want a headless API. And you're just not going to find in this ecosystem back then any meta frameworks, any headless commerce platforms, or anything like that. So it was pretty radical at the time when I went on stage and say, like, we should start fundamentally decoupling the front end and the back end. We should build the back end around APIs, and generate the front end with modern build tools. It was really a call to treat the front end as its own thing, its own app with its own Git repository, its own release management, its own global infrastructure, versus just being a derivative of whatever backend you were using. Or as we put it more succinctly later, Jamstack removes the need for business logic to dictate the web experience. And if we go back to these like very first slides I gave on the Jamstack, and what I talked about back then, this was the first slide sort of describing what went into the Jamstack. What is it actually? And think back again 8 years ago and remember life of FTPing into a server to update a bunch of WordPress files as part of your workflow, or running Capistrano, if people here even remember that, to SSH into a server, running a deploy with an asset pipeline run, with database migrations happening right on the server, and then symlinking a folder to go live. Think about to the time where CDNs were either something you would just offload your fonts or JavaScript bundles to, or something really big companies worked with, but definitely not something a normal front-end developer would set up for a website, where build tools were mainly Grunt and Gulp, and often just to create some bundles within a Rails application. where front-end frameworks were in their infancy, right? Like we were talking Angular 1 and Ember as the dominating players here, and where most of the websites you worked on had no API to talk to, and where the early stage API-driven CMSs were pretty niche and really small. I introduced this Jam philosophy of decoupling building and hosting, decoupling the front end and the back end, move from every server having its database migrations and so on, to encapsulating all your backend logic behind APIs. And then the idea of pre-baked markup enhanced with JavaScript, with the goal of going from a very complex world of a really complex web infrastructure, deployment flow, operational flow, to a simpler world that should ideally look something like this, where have a page and load something straight from an edge node out of a CDN, and you have this simple workflow. You push to Git, you run a build, talk to some APIs, you push the result to a CDN. Very simple conceptual model. And then during runtime, you would obviously you would load the application, and then you would talk to different APIs for the dynamic features. Now, there were two big pillars at the time going into this, and I think in this last year, people have weighted those very differently and interpreted those very differently. The first really big pillar, which to me was the core of this, was the decoupling. It was really the idea of moving the front end into its own application, away from our backend business logic, away from the tools we used to do APIs and services and business logic and data access, and into tools built specifically to building great user experiences. And this was really the decoupling that allowed us to build Netlify. It was what allowed us to start the modern concept of a front-end cloud that's now really become like commonplace and the standard for how you deploy modern web UIs, whether you're doing it with us or another vendor. It was the idea that allowed us to give release management specifically for your UI, with this idea of connecting to Git, pushing, and then having it run. It allowed us to go and invent the concept of deploy previews back in 2016. The idea that every single pull request or merge request you make through your Git provider would give you a unique URL that you could visit, that you could share with your coworkers, the stakeholders, and build with to create great experiences and great processes. It was also really this decoupling that allowed us to say, if you're running a full monolithic application, CDN is not really a great setup for that, right? Like you have all these individual points of presence scattered all across the world in a complex distributed system. But if you decouple the front end UI, CDN becomes an amazing place to run that. And you can really start talking about an application delivery network where you put this UI app on a global network and lower the friction for people to access it, and increase the ability to scale it automatically. It also gave us the ability to standardize how we think about local development in a way that you just didn't have before, right? Like back again, thinking back to 2016, if I were giving a new Ruby on Rails app or something like that, it was often a pretty complex setup. I would need to install the right database locally, run my own migrations, figure out all the pieces, compile Ruby in the right version, and so on. With modern front-end applications, typically, if they're decoupled, you just clone the repository, you run an npm install, and then you fire up Netlify dev or whatever dev server you're using, right? But it's just become a normal part of how we work. And it's, again, the side effect of this decoupling of the front end for all the other stuff you need to actually serve your customers. Now, the other big trend back then, and the other big piece we were talking about, and that's been a big topic since then, was the pre-baking, right? Like the idea of having a build step that can output as a static version of your site or app that you can deploy globally. This came with some very specific benefits that are still worthwhile if you go for this approach. The first one was the idea of atomic deploys, which is like in the full consequence only really viable as like atomic immutable deploys if you're taking this step, right? Like made us be able to say every single deployment you make is gonna persist. It's gonna have a set of files that all go live instantly at the same time, but it's also going to have this like repeatable history where you can roll back completely safely to any earlier point in time, because we know exactly what went into a deployment. And that pre-baking as a vendor gave us like a very strong contract around caching with developers building our platform, right? Like, so it allowed us to say when a build happened and it finishes, we know that this is the time where we can do an instant cache invalidation and we can free up all these assets. Again, gave us these atomic deploys with instant cache invalidation that could work globally. That was very hard to architect if you were not doing this. It also really matters for security. And this is something I think people are forgetting a little bit. People with some relation to Netlify might know the specific project Pets of Netlify. It's like very simple little 11T site that at a time all employees would go in and make a little pull request to add their pet, right? Like, so just yesterday I checked out this very simple little site. Again, it's just really basic, simple 11T site, but also one that's just been sitting around forever. No one has like done any real maintenance on it outside of adding pets. And I just ran NPM audit on this really simple project, right? Like it gave me 17 vulnerabilities, two of them critical and 7 of them high, right? Beauty of it, I really don't care, right? Like this, like these vulnerabilities are completely encapsulated at the build step. Nothing is exposed to users interacting with this site. So I really don't have to worry about it. But if this had been an equally simple site built without pre-baking, with dynamic server-side rendering, then who knows? Like these vulnerabilities might give end users access to environment variables in my system that would allow them to escalate and go to projects I really care about and do dangerous things. So I would need to react to these. I would need to go figure out like from probably the ancient version of 11T that we use from this, how would I update to a modern one? How would I get all the dependencies up to date and get this working? Pre-baking means I just don't have to worry about it. I also presented back in the talk sort of like an archetypes of different types of project you could build with this stack. There was websites really tailored well to like this kind of content-based pre-baking, build some content, ship it. It's probably not changing every minute, and the build is probably fast enough that this becomes really very viable. Single page applications, still a big fan of them. App.netlify.com is one of them, right? Like you ship a shell, you talk to different APIs and services. But then also the realization that there's this whole world of hybrids in between. Back then, the idea was more, okay, let's see how much we can pre-bake and then use different components or JavaScript methods to enhance the functionality and bring in the dynamic bits. I think this hybrid area is where we've seen the biggest shift over the last 8 years since I introduced this talk, and where we have very different tooling available now than we had 8 years ago. So let's talk about that journey from where we were and to where we are today. So back then, I mentioned that this was a really nascent ecosystem, right? Like again, we were a seed stage startup. Contentful had still not announced their Series A. There were no meta frameworks. There were very rudimentary, simple build tools. The first meta framework around Jamstack that emerged at that time was Gatsby. And one of the things Gatsby really brought to the market was the idea that we can think about the merits or not of, but the idea of React hydration, right? Like, so this was a big change, especially from the hybrid side of things. The idea that you would pre-build a lot of markup, but also when you requested a site and you loaded a page, React would kick in and essentially hydrate the whole DOM in that page into a new single page application. So every navigation after that would be very fast, but you would also couple the initial page load with a lot of JavaScript and a lot of logic, and you would essentially JavaScriptify every single part of the DOM for every page view. A little after this, we launched Netlify Functions, which was a pretty new part of the stack, right? Like until that, it really was like you have to pre-bake everything, output as at static files, and that's what you can do in this decoupled architecture with modern front-end cloud. Netlify Functions introduced the idea of a serverless runtime layer that you can deploy front-end logic into, that where you can build the backend for your front end, or where you suddenly could even do server-side rendering. And the next major framework was Next, that emerged on the scene, really capitalizing on this, right? Like again, relying on React hydration as the mechanism of essentially turning everything into a living application, but introduced the idea of choosing on a page per page basis between static or server-side rendering in serverless functions. And later on introduced this like middle ground called the incremental static regeneration, where instead of building everything statically, part of it you would have a serverless function build and persist on the very first visit, sort of a middle ground and a sliding scale towards something maybe a bit different. In 2020, we introduced the concept of edge handlers that complemented edge functions by giving us JavaScript code running globally around the world at the CDN request cycle. And later on, the idea of edge functions became popularized, and it's a common concept that we expect from any front-end cloud today. And the landscape of frameworks kind of exploded, right? Like this is just a slide of frameworks, modern frameworks in this space that have official financial backing from some company, right? Like we've gone from none in 2016 to this whole group that's even growing. I'm even missing a couple on this slide. I can see like quick, and we moved to this expanded version of what a front-end cloud looked like that now included both static assets, serverless functions, ISR functions, edge functions, and so on. And we've only expanded to that. And we really went from like this early day around like 2017, where the first stack that kind of emerged around the Jamstack was kind of Netlify and Gatsby and Contentful, to a world where we've just exploded in choice between all the different front-end clouds options now, the different frameworks options, the massive amount of headless CMSs, where now even the traditional CMSs are all asking to implement headless versions and composable architectures. We've seen an explosion in headless commerce, where again, 2016, you couldn't name a single headless commerce tool. Today, almost all the commerce tools you're interacting with have a headless version. And even the idea of databases as APIs with tools like Fauna, Supabase, SATA, and so on, that makes it easy to spin up a data backed service that feels like an API rather than feels like a database you're always interacting with. And then by the end of 2021, the React team made this big introduction of React server components that has shaken up the ecosystem we are in quite a bit. it took a while before we really saw sort of the first production ready version of this. If we've even truly seen that yet. But um, in 2022, Next.js, Vercel joined, launched the app router that took the existing pages browser that could really choose between like static, SSR, or ISR, and introduced this more complex but more powerful app router that gives you more granularity through React server components. And that's been sort of one of the big evolutions in the ecosystem as we look at just this is a chart from our from our annual report on the modern front-end web ecosystem, where we've asked our community a bunch of different questions. We had about 7,000 developers reply. And this is the graph for the report that shows the popularity of the different frameworks in our community. And there's no doubt right now that like Next is massively the dominating framework in the #1 place, with a vision of sort of solving everything, right? Like all of these different modes you can go to for the framework. This is Guillermo, the founder of Vercel, explaining the flexibility of Next, right? Like you have an SPA and an existing API, you can do it SPA plus data, you can do it static site from CSS, you can pre-render with Next, static site with personalization, you can pre-render with SSR streaming for the dynamic bitch or fetch for the client. And I could go on. There's so many different avenues and so on, right? Like, and someone asked him about one of these, and he replied like, Next passing a promise from an RSC into a client component that hydrates the initial state of a single page application data fetching layer like stale while revalidate. No, this is powerful, and it's a powerful tool, but it no longer feels simple when I think back to that original sort of like statement of where the web had gone and where we should move towards. When I look at the docs from Next.js, this is from the Next.js page doc on caching for Next.js, right? Like you see this diagram with the text that caching behavior changes depending on whether the route is statically or dynamically rendered, data is cached or uncached, and whether a request is part of an initial visit or subsequent navigation. Depending on your use case, you can configure the caching behavior for individual routes and data requests. Again, this is powerful, right? Like you can build powerful stuff with it, but it also feels a lot like this, right? Like it's hard to discern those two diagrams conceptually from each other. When I go back and think of where were we back then, what were we trying to achieve, and where have we come? We've definitely won in terms of decoupling the front end into its own thing. We're now almost seeing a separate pressure to see like, let's squeeze everything into the front end. Let's rebuild the monolith in this front end layer. But we made that decoupling happen. We made front-end developers much more powerful. We made release management much easier and infrastructure much easier. But it also got a lot more complex. So as we look at 2024 and beyond, where are we going from there, and where do I think the future lies? I think people are starting to really crave to get back to the feeling of simplicity again. And that's kind of like an internal cycle we've seen in every single landscape of development. If you've been around for a couple of decades, that like I have, right? Like you introduce no tools, you keep expanding what they can do, and at some point they become very complex, and you start thinking, how can we simplify? What can we do to make the mental model simpler with the knowledge we have now? Again, I think there's two paths that we can look to simplifying. One is looking more back at the idea of pre-baked Jamstack and see like this simple conceptual model that gave us a set of very strong cache contracts with our infrastructure that gave us like the benefits of security, of immutable deploys, and so on. What can we do with that? And if I go back to the survey of our community that we ran last year, we saw this like chart of not the total size of every framework, but of the changes in responses since the survey the year before. In the survey from 2022, the outlier was Vite. And I think in 2023, we really started seeing the effect of that with almost every framework starting to adopt Vite. This year or last year, the outlier was Astro that it suddenly catapulted into a big uptick in usage combined with a big uptick in the satisfaction score. People really saying like, we started using this new framework and we really like it. And I think that's really significant. And I think it comes from this urge to get to something simpler. I think the Astro team went back to the idea of like, how do we build content first websites? And how do we make those hybrids with an island architecture, right? Like where you can sort of go back to the core idea of like, what if we can pre-bake very easily, build out all the core pages, and then instead of hydrating everything and turning sort of every page into a full single page application with all the complexities, what if we can just pick the individual components that should actually do something interactive and make them small dynamic islands? It's really in our estimate in the survey when we looked at like why is Astro gaining this popularity, it's because it reduces the overhead and complexity compared to other framework. And again, I think the community is starting to really long for that. Simplicity is back. We're starting to see this island model get traction again. And we just launched at Netlify, developers.netlify.com, as our new developer portal, where we'll have pure developer content built with Astro, because the team was generally excited about the technology, and it's been a great experience. It's very simple to work with. Now, the other way to get to simplicity, some people might not think that this should come from me, but the other way to get to simplicity is to go the other way and say, let's forget about the pre-baking. Let's think about the decoupling, but let's embrace server-side rendering with this new architectural piece we have, right? Like if I think back to these original diagrams, this is how you would think about a single page application through the Jamstack lens, right? Like you would build a shell app, you would serve it straight out of CDN, and then you would talk to different APIs. I don't think it's a major, like fundamental architectural change if you do this instead. You have your build tool, you deploy it into a set of serverless functions, you cache in a CDN, and those serverless functions talk to the APIs. Now, it's very different if those serverless functions are just directly connected to a database and you're building a monolith with all your business logic again. But if the only change you make is that small change from, does the APIs talk directly to the browser or do they talk to a serverless function? That's not a major architectural change. And I want to remind everyone of a slide that I think people forget a bit from my original presentation in 2016, where I said like the Jamstack, the fundamental is not about static. It's about how do we build great dynamic experiences? How do we build the right user experiences? At the time, the only way to deliver these in a decoupled way is with static. That's not the case anymore. This starts becoming a viable model. And I think when we do this survey this year, I suspect that we'll see a similar outlier next year growing in both adoption and satisfaction. And I suspect that it'll be Remix. We'll see next year if we'll see at the end of the year if I'm right. Remix, especially after they got acquired by Shopify, has really been able to focus on simplicity again. It's a framework that it's taken the server-side rendering approach and said, like, we're not going to have all these like really complex different rendering modes. Instead, we're really going to start from like a server-side rendered mode, and make data loading and header control to do caching as simple and straightforward as we can. They recently embraced Vite, that, as I said, was the big outlier from last year's service, and basically turned all of Remix into a Vite plugin. Again, really going for simplicity. Started their experimental version of Remix for single page applications as well, just as a Vite plugin based on essentially React Router. And I think it'll be a really strong contender for the fastest growing framework this year. They lean into the concept of server-side rendering plus edge caching. Again, the simplest way to do edge caching would be to just set a cache control header. This would be a header that just tells any browser that visits the site, cache this page for 60 seconds. Problem here, as soon as you do this, you've said completely goodbye to atomic deploys. You don't actually control when any given user is getting something new from you. They could navigate from one page that's new to another page that's old. You could introduce like broken asset chunks. You could introduce like weirdness in navigation and so on. We recently launched a whole bunch of primitives on Netlify to make dynamic caching much better on our platform, in part because of the excitement around what you can do when you take it all into account. So the first one is just to use the standard of CDN cache control. CDN cache control allows you to scope the cache control to any specific vendor you're using. In this case, you're saying Netlify cache control, and you're just telling our cache to keep this content for 60 seconds, not the end user's cache. And this means that we can still automatically invalidate all of these assets on every deploy, and you still get a sense of atomicity. It's not the full atomicity of pre-baking everything, but you still get like instant cache invalidation on every deploy globally. We also introduced support for the stale viber validate header, where you can tell our edge to refresh in the background. So you essentially, in normal traffic, never have any user experience like a full SSR cycle apart from just after a deploy. As soon as that deploy is ready, users will always get a cached version of the page they're viewing, and then our CDN will go fetch a new version in the background. And again, we'll invalidate all of these assets on every full new deploy, so you never have to worry about like cache invalidation and troubles there. We also gave you like one level of control more, where you can say, okay, but give this specific asset a cache tag called API. Let's say this is a page that's built from a specific API. Now, instead of invalidating on deploy, you can tell Netlify every time that API updates, invalidate these assets, and you get like a new cycle of global caching, but with built-in invalidation. And you'll invalidate on API updates as well as deploys, right? Like, now the last, like, one other problem, because there's real challenges on doing caching well. One other problem you'll see, this is like just a small example site from our internal tests on Remix on Netlify. If we look at this site, this URL, when I go request this site, this will be the cache key that I'm caching this piece of content under, right? Like, and when I go in, a cache will look up, do we have a piece of content for this specific cache key, and serve it straight out of the edge if we do. Now, this is me sharing this site through Messenger or Facebook with a friend of mine. And notice that now the cache key suddenly includes a query parameter. The URL suddenly have a query parameter that's a unique session to me. If you go viral on social media and this is your caching strategy, this is pretty bad, because like now every single visitor is essentially getting their very own unique cache key, and it means that you're completely bypassing this whole CDN caching layer. So to work around that, you have to have some control over how you think about cache keys for every one of your endpoints. And again, at Netlify, we made that really simple by introducing the Netlify vary header. So in this example, I'm saying like vary based on the query parameters page and per page, but ignore all the other ones. So now if I visit this, it'll see like there's no page or per page. It'll generate a predictable cache key, and we'll get back to actually making caching work for these dynamic applications with a much lower cardinality cache keys. And again, the reason I think this SSI approach plus caching is exciting now is because we have modern front-end clouds now. Like back in 2016, CDNs was a completely different layer that you would put in front of your infrastructure that typically had a different networking team manage them, where typically the front-end developers had no control over how cache keys were made. You would have to go into Fastly and configure VCLs and so on. Today, we can bring both the serverless functions and the edge caching infrastructure together in one release cycle. And I think this will be a really powerful approach going forward. But I want to just end by saying, like, in this 8 years since we started, essentially the Jamstack won, right? Like, go back and look at WordPress, and for most of this time, it was completely dominating and growing. It's starting to very visibly decline. It's no longer the new kind of tool you go to build a new modern front-end project. The web content management magic quadrant that included all these big monolithic end-to-end systems, Gartner went and killed it in favor of the modern DXC and DXP quadrant because it's just not as relevant anymore, right? Like they called it, they reached maturity. I will challenge any one of you here to name a single new commercial CMS or e-commerce platform that was launched during these last 8 years that wasn't headless, right? Like basically we saw everything shift to this mode of building as the default. And we saw this amazing landscape emerge around the Jamstacks with billions of dollars in investment and with so much choice and so much different tooling. But it did also get kind of complicated. From simple beginnings, we got to a pretty complex point now. And I think as I think about 2024 and beyond, we should as a community look to like, what can we do to make things simpler again? Can we push back in that direction? And I think there's two paths. There's pushing back towards the pre-baked approach that gives us these out-of-the-box guarantees around security, reliability, and simplicity, but that doesn't necessarily stretch to e-commerce sites with a million SKUs or really complex, fast-changing social media sites or things like that. And then on the other hand, I think we have a possibility of leaning into SSR and edge caching now that we have these unified front-end platforms where the edge layer is integrated into deployments and runtime. That'll give us fast publishing, that'll let us scale content to millions of pieces. And that lets us introduce some server logic as the backend for the front end for when you're sending back a post request or when you want to wrangle a few different API calls and turn them into one thing. Thank you, and can't wait for the next 8 years of this. It's been an exciting journey, and with generative AI and all the new toolings we're about to get, it's only going to get more fun.
Thanks, Matt. That was a really great presentation. There's so many things I'd love to talk to you about. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left for Q&A. Yeah, that's okay. There's so much good information there. In fact, you and I have been talking about this stuff since, I mean, I don't even remember when. That was in Google, and you know, I presented about static site generators at Google, and that was like maybe 10 years ago, and we've been talking about it ever since. It's like, you know, it is amazing how quickly these things have changed. You know, and I think I personally am totally in agreement with you that things got a little complex. I've been talking about it for a while, and I tend to I give off that old man yells at cloud vibes when I complain about it. But but I think it's not just me that feels that way. I think one of the things I like about, say, like your caching solution or some of the frameworks that have come out lately, like Astro, as an example, although there are plenty of others like Levity and SvelteKit that I think kind of follow this, is like this simplicity by default, right? Like I want simplicity by default, but I need the ability to add complexity where it fits, right? I think Remix does this as well. Enhance is another one that I've been watching that kind of does it, like kind of starts with a simple premise, but gives me the tools and flexibility to add in that complexity. If I need to configure caching, or I need to add in some more complex configuration type things, I can do that. And that to me is like where the future lies, I believe. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think personally, I've always been a big fan of simple tools, right? Like everything gets complex organically. So if you can make your tools simpler, it makes your programs you're writing and the architectures you're building easier to reason about. I also understand why tools get more complex, right? Like because as you start expanding to more and more complex use cases, hit more and more edge cases and so on. If you are just diligently listening to customers, you will be adding in more and more functionalities. They'll expand the surface area of what your tool can do, and it'll become a very complex tool that has the advantage that, like, Next definitely had the advantage, have a strength in that you can use it across any use case, right? Like if you're really good at Next, you can use it across a lot of different use cases, but it comes with the price you pay in increased complexity. And I think in general, from my experience, there is a hybrid side of these use cases, but most of the time you're gonna know pretty well what kind of use case you actually have when we start out, right? Like so our website on netlify.com for many years we built with 11T, right? Like, and it's not like our core marketing site ever sort of organically emerged into becoming a complex application, right? Like it always stayed at a core marketing site. There's absolutely like island functionality and figuring in is the user logged in or not, and some personalization aspects and so on, right? Like, but it didn't like go organically over time to become an application. And on the other hand, like app.netlify.com was always like a single page application behind authentication, built with React and Redux and so on, right? Like, and it's also not sort of oddly morphed into becoming something else over time, right? Like, so in those cases, I would say like picking a tool that's great for that kind of use case is gonna work really well. And I believe a lot in tools that pick those areas more and say we're gonna make this really simple, and then we're gonna allow you to expand like somewhere out here, but we're not gonna build the everything machine to solve every problem up front, right? Like I think that's the only way, like being opinionated is the only way to create simplicity and easy ways to reason about your new architecture.
Yep, I agree there. And I think you make a really good point, which we can kind of, it's just going to close on, is that it doesn't have to be one size fits all for everything. Like you don't, just because you do one part of your site with Astro or 11D, and then you can do the other part with Next.js, like because that might fit a more complex, like the kind of backend piece. You don't have to choose one tool and say, okay, now everything we do has to be built with this tool. You can pick the right tools for the job. So that's a great point. And I really appreciate your time here, Matt. And I wish we had more time to just sit here and chat, because I always have a good time chatting with you and I always learn a lot. But thank you for coming out, and thank you for speaking.
Thank you for having me, and keep the conversation going. I'm on all the random platforms out there, so just hit me up.